In this lecture, we would understand what are endocrine glands and four major endocrine glands which we would discuss into detail. Those are the adrenal glands, pancreas, pituitary and thyroid. So all these would be discussed in detail. Let's understand first of all the difference between an endocrine gland versus the nervous system. So what are the differences that it shows? The first important thing is endocrine. Endo means within. That means the secretions are directly released into blood. There are no ducts. However, when we focus on exocrine glands, as we would further, the idea is these exocrine glands have ducts. Endocrine glands, on the other hand, are ductless, meaning they release their secretions directly into the blood. So, when it comes to differences between endocrine system and nervous system, the first difference is in nervous system we have series of neurons. However, in endocrine system, since they are ductless, there are secretory cells and they secrete directly into the bloodstream. Now, when we were discussing nervous system, we did a very simple example. Suppose there is a hot plate on the stove. You by mistake touch that hot plate. What happens? Within fraction of seconds, you would immediately move your hand away. Why? This is because of the electrical impulse that runs, and this electrical impulse is directed by your nervous system. Your hand sends the signal to the brain that this is hot. The brain sends the signal immediately back that it is hot. Remove your hand. So that's the simple way to understand the nervous system. The transmissions occur through electric impulse. However, in endocrine system, we have transmissions that occur through chemicals. So simply at one end, in nervous system, probably we are studying physics. However, in endocrine system, we are studying chemistry. In a simple way, you can understand that difference. Now, in a nervous system, the messages are transmitted from one neuron, synapse, another neuron. However, in an endocrine system, as we said, the secretions are directly into the blood and the transmissions take place through the blood. But they act only on the target receptor. They are flowing with the blood, but they know where to act. So specific target receptors are targeted and they are called as target organs. So in endocrine system, we have target organs that are directly affected. However, the message travels very slowly. In the nervous system, you touch a hot plate, you remove your hand immediately. That means the way the message travels is very quick. The electric impulses are very quick. The chemical signals are slow. The next important difference that we need to understand is, since in an endocrine system, we have target organs that are affected, it affects different part of the body. So we can say it is more or less generalized, widespread. The single result can be seen on different organs. However, in nervous system, the results are localized. I would just remove my hand. I won't move myself just because the plate was hot. I would remove my hand. So the effects are localized, affecting the specific muscle, the specific organ that is affected. And moreover, the time for which it lasts is very short. So within fraction of seconds, as we said, since the message is traveling very quickly, response is occurring very quickly, the time period for which it would last obviously would be very small. However, in an endocrine system, since it acts slowly, the time period for which it would last would be longer. So the effects of the endocrine system are long lasting as the message travels slowly. However, in the nervous system, the message travels very fast and therefore the impact lives for a very short duration. So that's the basic difference between a nervous system versus an endocrine system. Let's understand the difference between an endocrine gland, exocrine gland versus a heterocrine gland. So heterocrine gland we would come in a while. Let's first understand the difference between an endocrine gland versus an exocrine gland. So the difference is very simple. We have very simple animation to help you understand. In the first system, as you can see, we have the secretions which are poured directly into the blood vessels. As you can see the circles revolving here, this is an example of endocrine. Why? Endo means within. So the secretions are released directly within the blood, and since the secretions are directly released into the blood, there is no requirement for any ducts, and therefore these secretions are ductless, as we have seen here. However, on the other hand, we do have exocrine glands. The word exo means outside. So since it is an exocrine gland, what is the idea? The secretions are released, as you can see here, through the ducts, and the secretions are released out, and this is an example of exocrine glands. Sweat gland, a very common example of an exocrine gland. So sweat is released outside, and therefore we call this as an exocrine gland. So this is one of the basic difference that we understand between the exocrine versus the endocrine glands. Let's move on to each of these differences one by one in detail. So as the first difference we understood already, endocrine glands are ductless. However, exocrine glands have ducts. That means the secretions of an endocrine gland are released directly into the bloodstream. However, that is not the case with the exocrine glands. They are poured into the cavity by certain ducts, and therefore these are called as exocrine glands. The next important difference is endocrine glands, as we have understood in endocrine system, they have prolonged effect. The effect is long lasting because the message travels very slowly, and since the message travels slowly, the effect remains for a longer duration. Exocrine gland, you go out for a rigorous exercise and you do your workout, you do your exercise, and it's all sweating. So that's for a brief period. You return back, everything turns out to be normal. So sweat glands we can take as a very simple example to understand each of the characteristics of exocrine gland. So exocrine glands, the effect remains for a shorter duration. However, endocrine glands have prolonged impact. But the secretions of endocrine glands are very small. So the quantity, the proportion of secretions is relatively very less in endocrine gland. And why it is less? The answer again is very simple, because they secrete directly into the bloodstream. So even a small amount is sufficient. However, exocrine glands, large amount of secretions is done, and this is mainly because the secretions is by the duct. A small change in the amount of secretion would cause no disorder. So one day you work out more, other day you work out less. One day you might have higher proportion of sweat, other day you can have lower proportion of sweat, but that won't lead to a disorder. But the endocrine secretions are so important that even a minor change in the amount of secretion in the body can lead to significant disorders. Iodine deficiency is a common example. We would understand each of the glands into detail, but just to cite here, we have iodine as a common example. A very minor amount of iodine is added in the salt. So I want you to go back today and take out one of the salt packets in your home and see whether it is iodized salt, and if it is an iodized salt, how much proportion of iodine is there in a packet of 1 kg or 500 grams. You would be surprised to understand how a small amount of iodine is required, and if this small amount changes, this can even lead to disorders. Now, as mentioned, in an endocrine gland, the secretions are the hormones. Since they are hormones, they are chemical messengers and they affect the target cell. So all of the control is done by a feedback mechanism. That means, let's say my body runs sugar deficient, so I would have higher amount of sugar secretions in the body, and body would automatically try to cope up with the sugar deficiency that the body is suffering from. And this is what is known as a feedback mechanism. So there is a continuous feedback mechanism, and this is governed by chemical messengers. Exocrine glands are secretions that act as catalyst. That means they enhance the rate of reaction or the way in which the reaction progresses. Secretions of digestive juices are again good examples of exocrine gland. So we have certain common examples that we have here. Exocrine glands, salivary glands, sweat glands, mammary glands, gastric glands, then we have intestinal glands as some of the common examples of exocrine. Endocrine, thyroid, pituitary, adrenal, pancreas, ovaries, testes are common example. Now, you might ask, we did a term which was heterocrine. What is this heterocrine? We have not discussed. We just introduced this word prior. So, heterocrine glands are those glands which have a capability to function both as exo and endocrine glands. The best example we can give is pancreas. So pancreas are a unique gland which are endocrine as well as exocrine, and I was rather wondering why didn't you pointed out this question that we have written pancreas in both the categories, and that's why the reason is they are both exocrine as well as endocrine. Other good example of heterocrine glands is gastric mucosa. So gastric mucosa, which is released by the walls of the stomach, is again a heterocrine gland. And then we have placenta as another example of heterocrine gland. So these are some of the heterocrine glands, three important heterocrine glands, and the differences that exist between the endocrine glands versus the exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are the various glands across the body which release their secretion directly into the blood, and therefore, as we know, they are called as ductless glands, and these release the chemical messages, and these chemical messages are called nothing but hormones. So we often hear the term hormonal imbalance, and that is where we have endocrine glands which play an important role. How do they act and what is a feedback mechanism is something that we would discuss. To begin with, let's understand the various endocrine glands. We would understand those from the upper body towards the lower body. Starting from the brain, there are three important endocrine glands that we would understand. First, less commonly heard, is pineal gland, and it releases melatonin. So melatonin is the major secretion from pineal gland. We would talk about each of these glands individually in detail. Just an introduction here. The next is hypothalamus and pituitary. Both of those are located at the base of the brain, as you can see in the picture here, and they are in the diencephalon region. So hypothalamus is responsible for vasopressin, dopamine, somatostatin as some of the major secretions. However, pituitary is divided into anterior, posterior and intermediate lobe, and we have various growth hormones which are secreted by the pituitary gland. So pituitary is another important gland. So from the brain area we have three important glands. Moving on to the neck area. In the neck area, two important glands. The first important gland is the thyroid gland, and on the thyroid gland towards the shape of the thyroid that you can see here, there are two lobes which are connected by a isthmus, and these are four green ones are the parathyroid. These parathyroid are important because they basically have an important role to play, and thyroid, as we know, T3, T4, the common tests which are done in your blood samples as well. And thyroid is responsible for two important secretions. One is thyroxine and the other is calcitonin. So two important secretions by the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland, as we said, is present in the neck region or in the region on the either side of the trachea or the windpipe. The next important gland that we understand is in the stomach region. So from the liver we have IGF as the major secretion. Then we have the region of adrenal glands. Adrenal glands are two small cap-like features on either kidneys, and these have the adrenal cortex and medulla. That again we would understand in detail. The important secretions are glucocorticoids, then we have mineralocorticoids, androgens and adrenaline or non-adrenaline. So those are some of the major secretions from the adrenal gland. Then we have the next as pancreas. Pancreas is a leaf-like structure which is present, and insulin, glucagon and somatostatin are some of the major secretions. Now pancreas, we have the alpha, beta and the delta cells that are there. Coming on next is, in the females there is ovary, and from the ovary we have estrogen and progesterone as major secretions. In the males there is testes, and the major secretions are androgens and inhibin. So those are some of the major secretions from each of the gland. Now these secretions come up as hormones, which are chemical messengers. So as mentioned, they are from the endocrine glands, and therefore they are secreted by the glands which empty directly into the blood, and therefore are secreted by ductless glands. They have a capability to run in the bloodstream but affect only the target organ. They are required in very small amount, very meager quantity, and the reason is, since they are emptying directly into the bloodstream, even a small amount is sufficient to act. Soon after their action is completed, they are destroyed, which is a very important function to note. As soon as their action gets over, they are destroyed. If the amount of secretion is a little less, there can be diseases which can be due to hyposecretion. If the amount is little more, there can be diseases which can be due to hypersecretions. So there are disorders which are due to hypersecretions, which is more secretion, or hyposecretion, which is less secretion. As we mentioned, they are organ specific. They act only on targeted organs. And these hormones can either be proteins, polypeptides, new amino acids or steroids in nature. So there can be various different ways in which each cell affects another cell. So simply put, each target cell has a receptor. And their main idea is to maintain homeostasis, maintain and restore the balance. So as soon as a body feels deficient in something, the amount in which the hormones are secreted increases. And that's a normal method to bring them into a routine cycle. And this is what is known as a feedback mechanism. They regulate all the physiological process. But how? By the chemical method. So as we said, in endocrine glands, understanding the element of chemicals is very important. So hormones basically binds and they trigger certain cellular activity. This term hormone was first discovered by Bayliss and Starling in 1902, and as mentioned, they affect only target organs, but they circulate throughout the body. So receptors are, for example, if they are proteins of a specific shape, then they complement to a particular hormone. If they are steroids of a specific aspect, they complement to that specific element. So as we can see here, we have first of all the hormones that run into the bloodstream. They are the chemical messengers. They are running into the bloodstream. So this hormone enters from the endocrine gland directly into the bloodstream, and therefore these endocrine glands are called as secreting glands as well. They keep moving into the blood vessel unless and until they find a target organ. As soon as they find a receptor, they bind to the receptor. So we have the target cell, and you can see the endocrine glands. The hormones start to bind here, and these target cells are the receptors, and once they enter the correct receptor, they would have the binding. If they do not enter the correct receptor, they won't have the correct binding, and they won't affect that organ. So they would affect only the organ where they have a correct binding. Thyroid gland is one of the most important glands. You know why? Because it is the largest endocrine gland. So thyroid, which is the largest endocrine gland, is present in the neck area on the either side of the trachea or the windpipe. So as you can see here, this is the windpipe. On the either side of the windpipe there are two lobes, and these two lobes are the lobes of thyroid gland connected by a belt which is known as isthmus. So isthmus, as we know, similar isthmus in geography, we have the similar isthmus here that connects two glands here. So the thyroid, the two lobes are connected through the isthmus, and on the each of the thyroid, on either side of it, we have four green dots as you can see here, and these are the parathyroid glands. So parathyroid glands are again located on either side of the thyroid gland. Now thyroid has two important secretions. First is thyroxine, the most important T3, T4 secretions that we commonly hear. And the next is calcitonin. So two important secretions, I repeat again, thyroxine, calcitonin, very, very important. Now thyroxine, what is the major idea? It regulates growth, it regulates metabolism, development, and also regulates the basal metabolism, that is the cellular oxidation, and therefore it acts as a body's thermostat. So that is one of the major concepts why thyroxine is very, very important, and these secretions of thyroxine or thyroid gland are controlled by the master gland of the body. Which is the master gland of the body? You are correct, pituitary. So pituitary gland controls the secretions of the thyroid gland. Now coming on to thyroid, there can be disorders, as we say, as we studied in the section on hormones. Each of these glands, if there is more secretion, they can lead to disorder. If there is less secretion, again there can be disorders. So what is the disorder when the secretions are more and when the secretions are less? When the secretions are more, we say it leads to exophthalmic goitre. So exophthalmic goitre, what is the major characteristic? The most important characteristic is bulging eyes, nervous temperament, feeling restless about everything, higher pulse rate, faster heartbeat, and faster rate of metabolism in the body. So higher respiratory rate is again associated with hypersecretions. Hypersecretions lead to exophthalmic goitre, very, very important. However, hyposecretions lead to three important disorders: cretinism, Myxoedema, and simple goitre. Now what are these three? Let's understand these one by one. Cretinism is a kind of hyposecretion where the physical growth is retarded. As you can see in the picture here, pot belly, pigeon chest, deformed teeth are some of the common characteristics of cretinism. Also shorter height, shorter hands and feet, delayed physical growth, delayed or retarded mental growth are some of the indicators of cretinism. So cretinism is a kind of retardation, both mental as well as physical retardation. Pot belly, pigeon chest, two of the important characteristics of a child suffering from cretinism. The next is Myxoedema. Edema, as the name suggests, there is water retention. So there is swelling. Now with the swelling, usually it is below the eyes. So in the periorbital area there is swelling, edema. The face is much more dry. You have kind of swollen face because there is edema, water retention. There is swollen face, swelling on the hand, swelling on the body, waxy skin, kind of skin where it's a kind of puffy skin, we can say. Also there is feeble-mindedness and deposition of subcutaneous mucus fluid, which leads to edema here. So subcutaneous means below the skin. So subcutaneous mucus fluid is which is deposited in myxoedema. The next important one is simple goitre. The most common indicator is the swelling in the neck area. Now this is simply because the thyroid glands in the neck gets enlarged, as you can see, a normal case versus a case of simple goitre and enlargement of the thyroid gland. Now this is mainly due to deficiency of iodine, and how it can be fulfilled? By use of iodized salt. So iodized salt is the most common way of treating the problem of simple goitre. You might have seen people in hilly areas significantly develop more goitre issues. Why? The people in the hilly areas have iodine deficiency in the water, and therefore the salt is deficient in iodine, and therefore we have lack of iodized salt which is used. So one of the major responsible factors for simple goitre in the hilly areas is lack of iodine. So those are three of the important diseases that we have understood because of less secretion of thyroxine, which is cretinism, myxoedema and simple goitre. Secretions, more secretions of thyroxine leads to exophthalmic goitre, and thyroid, as we said, is the largest gland of the body. Two lobes connected by a isthmus. On the four corners you have the parathyroid which is located. And again, the most important thing that we need to understand is two important hormones, thyroxine and calcitonin, which are secreted by the thyroid gland. So those are some of the key aspects about thyroid, the secretions and the implications of hyper and hyposecretions. Pancreas are another very important gland, a pink-shaped leaf-like gland which is present in the body and governs the two important secretions. What are those? Those are insulin and glucagon. We would understand this in a while. Pancreas, as we have understood before, are heterocrine glands. What do you mean by heterocrine glands? Heterocrine glands are those glands which produce both endocrine functions as well as exocrine, who work as both endocrine as well as exocrine gland. Endocrine are those glands that release the secretion directly into the blood. They are ductless. Exocrine are those which have duct. Where is this pancreas situated? Pancreas, as you can see in this picture, so here you have the stomach that starts. So it is located in the posterior margins of the stomach in the loop of the duodenum. Now duodenum is the first part of your small intestine. Duodenum, jejunum and ileum. So duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. In the loop of duodenum you have the pancreas which are located. Now, there is another important thing that we commonly hear, a term known as diabetes. A very common comorbidity these days. Now, this comorbidity has further aggravated during this post-COVID scenario or the COVID phase. Worldwide, the data says that around 25 crore people across the globe are diabetic, of which 4 crore people are in India. It is believed that by 2025, nearly one child out of every 5 would be diabetic. So with that high incidence of diabetes, we need to understand how and what are the major functions of pancreas. Now, to begin with, as I said, there are two important elements. Those are the exocrine as well as the endocrine. Exocrine is the part which releases the pancreatic juice, which is carried by the pancreatic duct into the duodenum, and that helps in what? Definitely it is going to duodenum, small intestine, so helping with digestion. So this contains digestive enzymes that help with digestion. So within the close view of what is known as the islets of Langerhans, which are present in pancreas, we have three important cells, alpha, beta and delta cells, along with the duct which connects with the exocrine part, and this is where we have the exocrine gland. So exocrine gland, I repeat again, in the pancreas is the region where you have the pancreatic juice which is carried by the pancreatic duct, and this duct empties into duodenum. Duodenum is the first part of a small intestine, and this pancreatic juice contains the digestive enzymes useful for the digestion of the food. Coming back to the three important cells, alpha, beta and delta. Alpha, beta and delta are Greek terminologies. Alpha is the first alphabet of Greek letters. Now alpha cells here, as you can see, which are marked here, secretes glucagon. Beta cells secrete insulin, which are marked here, and then you have the yellow colored marking as the delta cells which secrete somatostatin. What is somatostatin? Let's understand that first. Somatostatin is an interesting thing that actually inhibits the secretion of both insulin and glucagon. So it controls the secretion of both insulin and glucagon. Now alpha, beta and delta are part of the endocrine glands. Exocrine gland, we saw that it empties into the pancreatic duct, into the duodenum, and here alpha, beta and delta are part of the endocrine gland. That means these are specialized endocrine cells that empty directly into the blood, and together they are known as islet of Langerhans, along with other exocrine glands which they are scattered with. Coming on to each of those. So first let's talk about the beta cells. Beta cells release what? We know insulin. What is the function of insulin? Whenever in the blood the amount of sugar rises, there is an immediate signal to release more of insulin. Why? The role of insulin is to convert glucose to glycogen, and this is done by insulin. So it controls the amount of sugar in the blood. That's the main role of insulin. So it controls carbohydrate metabolism. It maintains the blood glucose levels, as we already mentioned. It is used or it promotes the use of glucose by the body cells. So body cells would utilize more of glucose, and therefore there would be more absorption of glucose, and it also helps into the conversion of extra glucose into glycogen, and therefore maintains the amount of glucose in the body. So insulin mainly responsible for maintaining the amount of glucose in the body cells. Extra glucose is converted into glycogen by the liver cells and muscles. Two important things which converted, what are those? Liver cells and muscles. So liver cells and muscles would convert the extra glucose into glycogen. As mentioned, it would speed up the synthesis of fatty acid, slow down the process of gluconeogenesis and glucogenolysis, which we would understand in a while. Don't worry about the terminologies. And it would also accelerate the facilitated diffusion of glucose in the cells. To summarize again, insulin are released by beta cells. I am repeating this because it's very, very important. A lot of students confuse here. Insulin is secreted by beta cells. The idea is to control the excess amount of sugar in the blood, and therefore with more insulin the extra amount of glucose would be controlled, and this glucose would be converted into what? Glycogen. And if the glycogen is to be converted into glucose, what is responsible? So once during the time when I have high blood sugar levels, my extra glucose is converted into glycogen. This glycogen is stored where? In the muscles and the liver cells. Now, when there is a need for sugar in my body and there is no extra sugar coming in, what would happen? This glycogen, which is stored in the liver cells and the muscles, gets converted into glucose. How would this happen? This would happen through glucagon. Who secretes glucagon? Alpha cells. And who inhibit both the insulin and the glucagon? Somatostatin released by the delta cells. Okay, so glycogen is converted into glucose further by glucagon. Now, insulin is the first thing that we are talking about. As mentioned, insulin controls the carbohydrate metabolism, converts extra glucose into glycogen. Now, what would the hyposecretions and hypersecretions work on? So, when there is hyposecretion, less secretion of insulin, what would happen? If insulin is secreted less, there would be more sugar in the blood, correct? If there is more sugar in the blood, that sugar would be passed through urine, high level of glucose in the blood, and this is responsible for a disease which is known as diabetes mellitus. So, diabetes mellitus would be the disease which would be responsible or which would occur because of hyposecretions of insulin. Insulin controls the blood sugar. If insulin secretion is less, my blood glucose levels would be high. Therefore, more glucose, more sugar in the blood, more glucose in the urine, and feeling of excessive thirst, excessive urination, loss of weight, weakness are some of the common symptoms. In extreme cases, there can be damage to kidneys, loss of vision in extreme cases of diabetes. Now, this is because of less secretion. What would happen because of more secretion? Hypersecretion. If more of insulin is secreted, then my blood glucose levels would go down. That means hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia, a person becomes unconscious, can even collapse, and this is commonly seen in cases of insulin shock. What happens? A patient who is diabetic takes an insulin. If the levels of insulin taken by the patient are more than the patient should take at that moment, what would happen? The patient would immediately go into hypoglycemia, and this is what is known as insulin shock. Very, very dangerous, and therefore it is usually recommended that diabetes patients should always carry sweets or candies or something sweet with them in case there is an episode of hypoglycemia or insulin shock that can occur. So, role of insulin, very, very important in the body. Coming on to how this whole balance is done is through the feedback mechanism that we have understand in the separate section. The next is the role of glucagon. Glucagon is converting glycogen into glucose, as I mentioned before. So, our body, when there is excessive sugar in the body, our body converts this glucose into glycogen, and this glycogen is stored in liver cells, in muscles, and when there is a need, when I do not have a lot of sugar in the body or I am not intaking a lot of sugar, but my body is metabolizing and it requires some kind of sugar, what would happen? Immediately the signal would go and this glycogen would be broken down into glucose by glucagon. This process is known as glycogenolysis. Lysis means breaking. So there is breaking of the glycogen into glucose, which can be actively utilized by the body. Similarly, sometimes lactic acid or amino acid can be broken down into glucose as well by glucagon. So glucagon not just breaks down the glycogen, but also the lactic acid or the amino acid is broken down into glucose by glucagon. And this lactic acid or amino acid, when they are broken down into glucose, it is known as gluconeogenesis. So gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis, both of those are very, very important. The idea of glucagon, which is released by the alpha cells, is to raise the amount of glucose in the blood. Now, to raise the amount of glucose in the blood, where it will act? It would act on the liver cells. It would act on the muscles where the lactic acid is stored. And therefore, it stimulates more of the production of sugar. Now, a quick summary about pancreas. Pancreas, as we mentioned, are heterocrine glands, exocrine as well as endocrine. So, exocrine is the part which releases the pancreatic juice through the pancreatic duct into the duodenum. Endocrine is the part which releases the alpha cells, which has the alpha cells, beta cells and delta cells. Alpha cells are responsible for releasing of glucagon. Beta cells are responsible for release of insulin and delta cells are responsible for release of somatostatin. Somatostatin controls or inhibits both the insulin and the glucagon. So that's a quick summary about pancreas. Adrenal glands are another important glands which release adrenaline, noradrenaline and then glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids and so on. We would understand that in a while. But the idea here is, first of all, let's understand a little about adrenal glands. Where are they located? They are small caps on the top of what? Kidneys. So on the top of kidneys we have two small caps and this cap-like structure is the adrenal gland. So adrenal glands are located and they are in pair, one on the top of each of the kidney, and this adrenal gland is further bifurcated into two sections, outer and inner. Inner is dark red in color and the outer is less dark. So the outer one is known as cortex. It is called as adrenal cortex. The inner one is known as adrenal medulla. Okay, so the inner part is the medulla, outer part is the cortex. Cortex secretes what? Cortex, as the name suggests, it secretes cortical hormones. These cortical hormones are three: glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids and adrenocorticoids. So we would understand that in a while, but all of these are secreted by the cortex area. Now coming on next is the general classification, what is released and what is secreted by cortex and what is secreted by medulla. So cortex, as I mentioned, three of those, we would understand these one by one, and then medulla again, adrenaline and noradrenaline. So the flight and the fight response system, as we know. First, talk about the outer layers. Outer layers is the cortex. Cortex has three important hormones. Glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids again has three important versions: cortisol, cortisone and cortisterone. All of these help in the regulation or the metabolism of what? Fat, protein and carbohydrate. So fat, protein and carbohydrate, the metabolism of this is done by glucocorticoids. Now glucocorticoids basically regulate the amount of blood sugar. Since they are regulating the amount of blood sugar, they, in the case of sugar deficiency, would encourage body to form more glucose. How is more glucose formed? We know well, by the process of glycogenesis and glucogenolysis, how the glycogen is converted into glucose by glucagon released by the pancreas. Also, lactic acid or amino acids are converted into glucose by glucagon. So, these are responsible, and this glucocorticoids also help us adapt to the stress situation. Any external stress situation, our body is adapted with the help of this. The next is Mineralocorticoids or aldosterone. Now, aldosterone are very important. They help in the salt-water balance. So, this salt-water balance, where it is important? In the kidneys. It helps in controlling the reabsorption of sodium by the kidneys, and this is responsible for maintaining the sodium-potassium ratio within the body and regulating the internal metabolism. So, mineralocorticoids are responsible for salt-water balance or the sodium-potassium balance. So, sodium-potassium balance is maintained through it. The next is Adrenocorticoids. Now, these stimulate the development and maturation of reproductive organs in males as well as in females. So, in males we have broad shoulders, deep voice, mustache. The next is adrenal medulla. Now, adrenal medulla, two important hormones which are secreted, noradrenaline and adrenaline. Noradrenaline is also known as norepinephrine. The idea is it regulates the blood pressure in the body. How? By constriction of the small arteries that is present. Now, whenever our body is faced with a crisis situation, there can be two responses. One is a fight response. Either we would fight with that or we would run away from that. This occurs through adrenaline. Adrenaline or epinephrine is therefore known as an emergency hormone. So, control of emotions, control of heartbeat, blood pressure, control of muscle movements, the smooth muscle movements, whether they should be relaxed or they should be constricted, is governed by adrenaline, and it provides a good link between the nervous and the endocrine system. Most of the medullary secretions are released through adrenaline. Adrenaline always prepares oneself for any emergency situation to occur. Now, coming on to the diseases which are caused by hypersecretion or hyposecretion from adrenal glands. So, hypersecretion, there are two important diseases. What are those? Cushing syndrome and adrenal virilism. However, less secretion by the adrenal glands can lead to Addison disease. Now, Addison disease is a disease where the amount of glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids are reduced in the body. As a result, what would happen? The sodium-salt balance, the salt-water balance is not fine, and there are issues which can lead to declining weight. There can be weak bones, osteoporosis, hypoglycemia, reduced blood sugar levels, retention of water, and excessive deposition of melanin in the body. Now, melanin pigment, when it gets excessively deposited, it gives a appearance of a bronzy skin. So, bronze colored skin, and bronzy skin is one of the very important markers of Addison disease. Very important to note. A most important symptom of Addison disease, which is due to hyposecretion by adrenal glands, deficiency of two hormones, glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. Now, hypersecretions. Hypersecretions, as we know, can lead to two important diseases, the Cushing syndrome and the adrenal virilism. Here we have a repeat of the Addison disease, how the bronzy skin criteria is explained here. The next that we understand is the Cushing syndrome. Now, Cushing syndrome, which is due to excess of glucocorticoids, would lead to obesity. Now, it would also lead to hyperglycemia. More of the sugar levels in the blood. This would be responsible for thin arms and thin legs. So as you can see in the picture, weak muscles, thin arms and thin legs but heavy body and moon-shaped face are some of the typical symptoms of Cushing syndrome. And one of the major reasons for this Cushing syndrome is a long-term use of steroids. A long-term use of steroids can lead to Cushing syndromes, and therefore limited use of steroids has been recommended even in the COVID times. The next is the adrenal virilism. Now, adrenal virilism is due to hypersecretions by adrenal glands, and in females this is due to the growth of androgens which cause male-like characteristics. However, in males, it is due to the overgrowth of cortex which lead to female-like characteristics. And this is known as adrenal virilism. So, three important diseases with adrenal glands. First is the disease due to hyposecretion, which is Addison disease. Bronzy skin is the most common symptom. Hypersecretion. Two important diseases, adrenal virilism and Cushing syndrome. Cushing syndrome is important because it is due to long-term use of steroids caused due to excessive glucosteroids in the body or glucocorticoids in the body. And a major characteristic is thin legs and thin hands with higher levels of glucose and a moon-shaped face. So those are the classic characteristics of Cushing syndrome. In this section, we would understand pituitary gland. This gland is also known as the master gland. Where it is located? You are correct. It is located in the brain. So here in the brain, we have the pituitary gland responsible for most of the hormones. Now, this pituitary gland is an interesting gland. Why? Because it is first of all the size of a pea seed, a very small gland, but still the master of all and therefore called as the master gland of the body. It secretes topical hormones. Tropical hormones are those hormones, these topical hormones actually are the hormones that go and send signals to other endocrine glands. For example, there would be signals to thyroid, there would be signals to gonads to release certain hormones, and therefore they are known as the topical hormone. So these tropic hormones target or send a signal where they send a signal to anterior pituitary. We will understand in a while what is it. So let's move here. What is this? You are correct. This is an image of a brain. So we have cerebrum, which is the outer region. This is the brain stem, and this is the region of cerebellum. Now, what I do is I just move this brain. Now, when I am moving this brain, we are diving into what's inside the brain. So, inside the brain, we have the corpus callosum. Now, definitely that goes into detail when we have studied our structure of brain and the anatomy of brain. But to understand, this region here is the region which is the pituitary. So pituitary is located here, and this is the master gland. As you can see, small pea-sized structure. Now let me elaborate it and create it in a bigger picture. So this is the bigger picture of the same pituitary gland. Now this pituitary gland, as you can see, has three structures. What are those? Those are the anterior pituitary, the anterior lobe as it is called as, intermediate lobe, and the posterior lobe. What is the difference? Anterior, what is in the front? Posterior, what is in the back? And intermediate between the two. So three lobes, anterior, posterior and intermediate. All of these three release major hormones. Posterior releases two major hormones. Intermediate releases one major hormone. Anterior releases six major hormones. So 6 for anterior, 1 for intermediate and 2 for posterior, that we would understand. So let's talk about the simplest one, that is the intermediate lobe. So as you can see here, within this pituitary, we have the intermediate lobe, which is located between the posterior and the anterior. Now this intermediate lobe secretes MSH. MSH is melanocyte stimulating hormone. Melanocyte stimulating hormone controls the secretion of melanocyte in the skin. Okay, so this is by the intermediate lobe. Just one important hormone that you need to know. MSH, melanocyte, I'll write here, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, the next important one is understanding the anterior and the posterior hormones. So here, as I said, the front part is the anterior, the back portion is the posterior. Anterior is towards the front, posterior is towards the back. So let's begin with the anterior pituitary. 6 important hormones: GH, TSH, FSH, LH, PRL and ACTH. Let's understand these one by one. The first one is growth hormone, GH. This growth hormone is also known as somatotropic hormone. Somatotropic hormone is responsible for growth in the body. If this is in hyposecretion, it can lead to dwarfism, small people. If it is in youth secretion, it can lead to gigantism, that is huge people. Okay, so that is the growth hormone, dwarfism due to hyposecretion and gigantism due to hypersecretion. The next is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone is also known as thyrotropic hormone. Thyrotropic hormone controls the growth and the functioning of thyroid and therefore stimulates the production of thyroxine in the body, and therefore it is governed by the pituitary, and so we call pituitary as the master gland. So pituitary controls the thyroid gland secretes the thyroid stimulating thyroxine, which is the release factor of it, and this is done through the pituitary, TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. The next is the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Now in males, it is responsible for formation of sperm by the process of spermatogenesis. In females, it is responsible for maturation of ovarian follicles. The next is ACTH. ACTH is Adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is responsible for growth and development of adrenal cortex. Now adrenal cortex is adrenal gland, the 2 glands above the 2 kidneys, the cap-shaped structure as we know, and these are responsible or answerable to pituitary. So ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone released, which governs the growth and development of adrenal cortex, and it stimulates the release of glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and if the secretions are less, they can lead to what? They can lead to Addison disease. Addison disease characterized by bronzy skin. So ACTH, the adrenal glands, the adrenal cortex gland controlled by anterior pituitary. The next is LH, luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is a hormone which in males is responsible for secretion of testosterone and the secondary sexual characters. However, in female, it is responsible for the secretion of progesterone and also for the ovulation. So both FSH and LH are gonads, so gonad hormones as they are called as. The next is PRL, prolactin. Prolactin is the lectinogenic hormone, and this is responsible for the mammary glands during the pregnancy and even after the childbirth. The next is the posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary, again 2 important glands. One is ADH, The next is oxytocin. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. It is also known as vasopressin. Vasopressin or antidiuretic. Now antidiuretic, that means it controls the reabsorption of water from the glomerular filtrate in the kidneys. And antidiuretic. So diuretic means higher amount of urine. Antidiuretic means reduced amount of urine. So this causes contraction of the small arteries, increasing the blood pressure and reducing the amount of urine. So higher blood pressure, lower amount of urine by ADH or antidiuretic hormone. Hyposecretions of ADH, very important to note, can lead to a condition which is known as diabetes insipidus. Now, important to note that diabetes insipidus is different from diabetes mellitus. Diabetes mellitus is caused by the hyposecretions of insulin. However, here hyposecretions of ADH can lead to diabetes insipidus, and this is a condition when the amount of urine is excess, but this is without sugar. There is no sugar found in urine. However, in diabetes mellitus, sugar is present in urine or glucose is present in urine. In diabetes insipidus, no sugar is present in urine. So, no sugar in urine, very, very important. And this is not a condition of diabetes mellitus. Now, hypersecretion of ADH, as I mentioned, can lead to higher arterial pressure or higher blood pressure. So, if the amount of ADH is high, it would lead to higher blood pressures. The next is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is an important hormone which is responsible for contraction of uterus during the time of childbirth, and therefore it is also known as the birth hormone. Oxytocin is an important hormone because it is also responsible for expulsion of milk. So, those two are the hormones which are released by posterior pituitary. To repeat again, anterior pituitary we have the topical hormones. Topical hormones are those hormones that govern other endocrine glands like thyroid, adrenal cortex and gonads, as we have understood. Then we have the posterior pituitary where ADH and oxytocin are there. In the intermediate we have melatonin, and in the anterior pituitary we have the growth hormone FSH, LH, PRL, then you have ECTH and TSH as the major hormones in the anterior pituitary. So that was about the pituitary glands and a quick summary of the various hormones released by pituitary. What is a feedback mechanism? The process of feedback mechanism is very, very simple. Our body remains in a normal state, but how it maintains the normal state is really interesting. What happens is sometimes our body realizes that there is a need for increase in secretions. So what would happen? A signal would go to the respective gland to increase the secretions. Now once the secretion increases, the levels that had fallen below in the blood would increase and we would attain a normal position. But what happens if these secretions continue? If these secretions would continue, there can be oversecretion. So there is a negative feedback mechanism that automatically controls that now there is no more need to release the secretion. We should stop the secretion. So the idea is the end product that is received is regulated. So we are trying to regulate the end product. Now, this process of regulating the end product occurs in two ways. One is the positive feedback. Positive feedback is a feedback when we are increasing the secretions to reach their exact level in the blood. However, when the secretions are too much, what we need to do is we need to have a negative feedback. We need to reduce the secretions, and this reduction in the secretion in order to come back to normalcy would be called as a negative feedback. Now this might appear a little confusing, so we have a very simple example from our daily cooking life. What happens? Let's say I am preparing a dish today, but I forgot to add salt to it. Now I serve you the dish. You might say, oh, everything looks fine, but there is no salt. Now, this is a positive feedback. Why? Because I have the chance to add the salt. So what I do is, I add the salt, I serve you again, and you enjoy the dish. But let's take another example. In this example, I by mistake put the salt, let's say twice or thrice, consider it 3 times. So my salt level in the food is 3 times than it should be. Now what would happen? The only thing is, it is not at all good for health, we can say. So the only way to neutralize it, definitely I need to neutralize, otherwise this won't be useful. So the only way to neutralize is, probably I'll add more water or more of other ingredients in order to reduce the amount of salt. And this is what is a negative feedback. So with the same example of salt, we understood a case of positive feedback, where in the first case we forgot to add the salt and we were able to add the salt. However, with the same example, we understood an example of negative feedback where the salt levels were already high. So we needed to reduce the amount of salt levels, and that is the negative feedback. Now let's come to our body organs. So we will talk about 2 simple endocrine glands. One is pancreas, the other is thyroid. Both of those, how this feedback mechanism would work. Now, what happens with pancreas? Pancreas releases insulin, correct? What is the function of insulin? The function of insulin is to control, or I can say absorb, more of blood sugar. So the idea is, the blood glucose level or the sugar levels should be maintained. Now, let's say if I consume lot of cakes, lot of pastries, lots of chocolates, lots of sweets, what would happen? My blood sugar levels would suddenly go up. Now, as soon as my blood sugar levels goes up, they can go up to a level that they can damage the blood vessels. There can be blood not reaching certain parts of the cells, and there can be significant impact on the body because of it. So immediately pancreas are asked to release insulin. As soon as pancreas release insulin, they start to control the level of the blood sugar, or we say the glucose is converted to glycogen. So the process of conversion of glucose to glycogen starts. Now, with this process, what would happen? My blood sugar levels would go down and would come towards normal. But if they keep dropping, what would happen? There should be a point where the signal should go back to the pancreas. And what is the signal? My blood sugar levels are down. Stop secreting insulin. So as soon as this negative feedback goes, the pancreas would stop secreting insulin. Now the insulin secretion would stop. So the amount of blood glucose which is being controlled would reduce, and the falling blood sugar levels would again reduce. So our body is able to maintain a normal blood sugar level. So that is how the feedback mechanisms occur. Mostly when we say this feedback mechanism occurs when we have to do a negative feedback. We want to control the secretions, and there is where most of the utility of these secretions work. The next good example is thyroid gland. Now, where does the thyroid gets the signal from? Definitely true. Thyroid gets the signal from pituitary. Now, pituitary is a pea-sized lobe located in the brain. This pea-sized lobe, which is the master gland, sends the signal to whom? Sends the signal to thyroid gland. So, here we have the thyroid gland. The 2 lobes of the thyroid gland and the isthmus that joins the thyroid gland. We have understood about this more in detail on the lesson on thyroid. Now, this thyroid gland releases what? We know well. 2 important products, thyroxine and calcitonin. We are focusing on thyroxine right now. So, Pituitary sends the signal to thyroid, which is to release TSH-RH, which is thyroxine stimulating hormone release hormone. Now this TSH is released by the thyroid as thyroxine. Now this thyroxine level, as soon as the thyroxine level increases, what would happen? The metabolism in the body would start to increase. Now, as soon as the metabolism increases, the brain would check that there should not be too much metabolism. If the metabolism increases too much, then it would again be problematic. So what we need to do is, this metabolism would keep on rising, but at a point it would send the signal back to brain that the metabolism is at its peak. Now stop metabolizing. So pituitary would send a signal to thyroid, stop secreting TSH. TSH, thyroxine, which is released here, the release would stop, and finally the release would stop and metabolism would stop.